Picture this. It's December 1941, and a German tank commander is trying to start his Panzer III outside Moscow. He turns the key. Nothing. The engine oil has turned into a solid block of ice. His gunner tries to load the main cannon. The recoil mechanism is frozen solid. His machine gunner pulls the trigger. Click. The firing pin snaps like a twig. Across the entire Eastern Front, thousands of German tanks, the most feared war machines on the planet, are being turned into 20-ton coffins not by Soviet shells, but by temperatures dropping to -68 degrees Fahrenheit. In the winter of 1941 to 1942, more German Panzers were destroyed by frost than by all Allied tanks combined up to that point in the entire war. This wasn't just cold weather. This was one of the most severe winters Russia had seen in over a century, and the German Wehrmacht walked straight into it wearing summer uniforms. Today, I'm going to tell you the real story of how General Winter became Germany's deadliest enemy, and how Hitler's gamble to conquer the Soviet Union before the snow fell turned into the greatest military disaster in modern history. But before we dive into this frozen nightmare, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because you don't want to miss the incredible historical deep dives we've got coming your way. The gamble that couldn't fail. On June 22, 1941, Adolf Hitler launched Operation Barbarossa, the largest military invasion in human history. Over 3.8 million German and Axis troops smashed across the Soviet border on an 1,800-mile front. It wasn't just big, it was unstoppable. The Wehrmacht brought 3,000 tanks, 7,000 artillery pieces, and 2,500 aircraft. This was 80% of Germany's entire military might, and Hitler had one simple prediction: the Soviet Union would collapse within 8 to 10 weeks. He told his generals, "We have only to kick in the door and the whole rotten structure will come crashing down." And honestly, for the first few months it looked like he was right. German panzers raced 200 miles beyond the frontier in the first week. By late June, they'd encircled and captured 300,000 Soviet soldiers at Minsk. The Luftwaffe destroyed over 2,000 Soviet aircraft in just the first 2 days, most of them on the ground before they could even take off. By mid-July, the Germans had advanced more than 400 miles and were only 200 miles from Moscow. Soviet casualties were catastrophic. Entire armies were being surrounded and annihilated in massive encirclement battles. The Red Army was caught completely unprepared, still reeling from Stalin's purges of the officer corps in the late 30s. Germany was fighting a disorganized, poorly led enemy, and they were winning decisively. But here's the thing nobody in Berlin wanted to acknowledge: the Soviets weren't surrendering. Even as German forces captured 3 million Soviet soldiers by Christmas, 3 million fresh divisions kept appearing at the front. Soviet intelligence had been moving over 1,500 industrial plants east to the Urals, along with 10 million workers. 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, these factories were pumping out tanks, guns, and aircraft, even before the buildings around them were finished. The whole operation was premised on speed. Barbarossa wasn't designed for a long war of attrition. It was a knockout punch. Germany's industrial capacity couldn't sustain a prolonged campaign, especially not with Britain still in the fight and America growing more hostile by the month. Hitler needed Moscow before winter, and his planners knew it. That's why when Wehrmacht quartermasters tried to make provisions for winter clothing and equipment, they were actually criticized for negative thinking. This was going to be a summer campaign, period. The troops loaded into trucks and trains wearing lightweight uniforms suitable for July and August. Nobody packed parkas. Nobody shipped antifreeze. The winter gear that did exist sat in warehouses back in Germany, because using up valuable transport space for clothing would mean less ammunition and fuel at the front. The logic made sense if you were going to win in 3 months. But by September, the Germans were still fighting. October came, and the autumn rains turned Russian roads into rivers of mud. The famous German mobility, the Blitzkrieg that had conquered France in 6 weeks, ground to a halt. Tanks became stuck axle-deep in the muck. Supply trucks couldn't get through. The advance slowed to a crawl. And then, in early November, the temperature dropped. This wasn't a normal Russian winter. The winter of 1941 to 1942 was one of the most severe in Russian history. Temperatures plummeted to 46 degrees below 0 Celsius. That's negative 51 Fahrenheit in some areas, and in the worst zones, it hit negative 68. German soldiers who'd started the campaign in June were still wearing the same summer weight uniforms. There were no winter coats, no insulated boots, no gloves thick enough to prevent frostbite. The men stuffed newspapers and straw into their uniforms trying to stay warm. They wrapped their feet in rags. They stole coats off dead Soviet soldiers and wore women's clothing looted from abandoned villages. It would have been almost comical if it wasn't so deadly. By the end of December 1941, the German army reported over 100,000 cases of frostbite. 15,000 limbs had to be amputated. Entire units were rendered combat ineffective not by enemy action, but by the cold. Soldiers were freezing to death in their foxholes. But the real catastrophe? The machines were freezing too. When steel turns to ice. Let me paint you a picture of what happened to German armor when the temperature dropped below negative 20 degrees Celsius. A Panzer commander would wake up before dawn and immediately know they had a problem. The tank wouldn't start. The engine oil, designed for European climates, had congealed into something resembling axle grease. The transmission oil had turned into a solid block. The fuel had gelled. Starting a tank engine required the crew to first build a fire underneath the vehicle just to warm it up enough to turn over. Sometimes it took hours. Sometimes the tank never started at all. General Heinz Guderian, one of Germany's most brilliant panzer commanders, wrote in frustration to headquarters in mid-November, "How do you expect us to crank up a tank engine at minus 20 degrees? The pistons are frozen. The transmission oil is a solid block of ice, and the recoils on our guns are stuck." He was furious because while critical winter equipment wasn't arriving at the front, a shipment of red wine from France had made it through, frozen solid into lumps of red ice. That's the level of dysfunction we're talking about. The wine showed up, but the antifreeze didn't. Even when tanks could start, they could barely move. German tanks used narrow tracks designed for European roads and moderate terrain. In deep Russian snow, these tracks provided almost no traction. The tanks would slip, slide, and bog down. Meanwhile, Soviet T-34 tanks had wide tracks specifically designed for winter conditions. They could move across snow that would trap a German panzer. The T-34 also had a compressed air starter system that made it immune to frost. While German crews were building fires under their tanks, Soviet tankers just pressed a button. But it gets worse. The weapons themselves stopped working. Rifle bolts froze shut. Machine guns seized up. Artillery pieces couldn't recoil properly because the hydraulic fluid had frozen. There are accounts of German soldiers having to cut their bread rations with axes because the bread was frozen solid. Mess kit food had to be chopped out of containers with tools. Troops couldn't shave because water froze the instant it touched metal. Everything that could freeze did freeze. The German army used thousands of horses for logistics. Over 600,000 horses were committed to Barbarossa. These weren't hardy Russian ponies adapted to the cold. These were horses brought from Western Europe. They started dying in massive numbers. Thousands of them froze to death or collapsed from exhaustion trying to pull supply wagons through snow drifts. Without horses, supplies couldn't reach the front lines. Without supplies, the tanks couldn't refuel and the men couldn't eat. The entire logistical chain was collapsing. Here's a number that should blow your mind. German forces suffered 743,000 casualties from June 22nd to November 30th, 1941. That's 23% of their total invasion force in just 5 months. But the frostbite casualties that winter alone exceeded 100,000. Think about that. More German soldiers were taken out of action by the weather than by Soviet bullets in many sectors. By early December, Army Group Center, the force tasked with taking Moscow, was at the absolute limit of its endurance. They'd pushed to within 12 miles of the Soviet capital. German officers with binoculars could see the spires of the Kremlin in the distance. But they couldn't go any farther. The men were exhausted. The tanks were frozen. Ammunition was running low. Food supplies were sporadic. And the temperature just kept dropping. The Wehrmacht had never experienced anything like this. In France, they'd fought a 6-week campaign in spring and summer. In Poland, it had been a 3-week blitz in September. They'd conquered Yugoslavia and Greece in a matter of weeks. But Russia was different. The distances were vast. The enemy kept fighting. And winter was a force of nature that couldn't be outmaneuvered or outgunned. Soviet soldiers, meanwhile, were equipped for this. They had quilted jackets, fur-lined hats, felt boots called valenki, and white camouflage that let them blend into the snow. They knew how to dig winter dugouts. They knew how to keep weapons functioning in extreme cold. They'd trained for this their entire military careers. More importantly, Stalin had been moving Siberian divisions west. These were troops who'd spent their entire lives in conditions even harsher than what Moscow was experiencing. They were battle-hardened from border conflicts with Japan. They were fresh, well-equipped, and they knew how to fight in the snow. On December 5, 1941, Soviet General Georgy Zhukov launched a massive counteroffensive with over 1 million troops. The Germans were caught completely off guard. Hitler had been told that the Soviet Union was on the verge of collapse. His intelligence services insisted that Stalin had no reserves left. They were catastrophically wrong. The counterattack and the retreat. The Soviet winter counteroffensive hit the frozen, exhausted German armies like a freight train. Zhukov threw fresh Siberian divisions, soldiers who could operate in temperatures that paralyzed the Wehrmacht, against German positions that had been stretched to the breaking point. The attack struck army group centers flanks north and south of Moscow, in the sectors around Klin, Kalinin, Tula, and Elets. German troops who could barely move in the deep snow, who were suffering from frostbite and hypothermia, suddenly found themselves under assault by an enemy that seemed immune to the cold. The psychological impact was devastating. For months, the Germans had been advancing. They'd won every major engagement. They'd surrounded and destroyed Soviet armies with almost casual efficiency. Now they were being pushed back. The Soviets wearing white snow camouflage would appear seemingly out of nowhere, skiing through the forests, launching attacks and then disappearing before the Germans could properly respond. It was guerrilla warfare on a massive scale, and the Wehrmacht had no answer for it. Hitler's response to the crisis was characteristically inflexible. On December 16th, he issued a standfast order. German forces were not to retreat. They were to hold their positions regardless of the situation. Any commander who withdrew without permission would face court-martial. This order probably prevented the retreat from turning into a complete rout like Napoleon's army in 1812, but it also trapped thousands of German soldiers in positions they couldn't defend. Units were surrounded, cut off from supply, and left to fend for themselves in temperatures that were literally lethal. Small groups of German soldiers found themselves isolated in villages, surrounded by Soviet forces, with no food, no ammunition, and no hope of rescue. Some held out for weeks before finally surrendering or being overrun. The retreat, and despite Hitler's orders, it was a retreat, turned into a nightmare. German soldiers abandoned equipment they couldn't carry. Tanks that wouldn't start were blown up to prevent capture. Artillery pieces were left in the snow. Trucks were set on fire. The roads back toward German lines became littered with destroyed vehicles and frozen corpses. It was estimated that, at some points, the Soviets pushed the Germans back up to 155 miles. Entire sectors of the front collapsed. The grand encirclement strategy that had worked so well in the summer was now being used against the Germans. Soviet forces would bypass German strongpoints, cut their supply lines, and force them to retreat or be surrounded. And through it all, the cold kept killing. A German officer wrote in his diary, "Thus we are approaching our final goal, Moscow, step by step. It is icy cold, and we are expending our last ounce of strength. The hills are covered with tanks and dead Russians, but hardly any food supplies are reaching us. Every day we are waiting and hoping for the distribution of real winter clothing, but so far in vain." That entry was from November. By January, many of those men were dead. Guderian's 2nd Panzer Army lost twice as many men to frostbite as to enemy fire. Let that sink in. a mechanized armor formation designed to spearhead blitzkrieg attacks, was being destroyed by the weather at a 2-to-1 ratio compared to combat. Tank crews were particularly vulnerable. Inside a tank, there's no insulation. The metal walls conduct cold directly into the interior. Crews had to choose between running the engine constantly to generate heat, wasting precious fuel, or enduring temperatures inside the tank that could drop below freezing. Many tankers chose to sleep outside their vehicles, digging holes in the snow, because it was actually warmer than being inside a steel box. The German army's horse population was devastated. By the end of winter, hundreds of thousands of horses had died. This wasn't just an inconvenience, it was catastrophic. German logistics relied heavily on horse-drawn transport. Losing the horses meant losing the ability to move supplies forward and wounded soldiers back. Entire infantry divisions became immobilized. By March 1942, when the spring thaw finally came and the counteroffensive petered out, the Germans had suffered somewhere between 250,000 and 400,000 casualties in the Battle of Moscow alone. The Soviets had lost more. Estimates range from 600,000 to over 1 million killed, wounded, or captured, but the Soviet Union could replace those losses. Germany could not. More importantly, the myth of Wehrmacht invincibility was shattered. Hitler's first major defeat on land sent shockwaves through the German military establishment. The easy victories were over. The quick knockout punch had failed. And ahead lay years of grinding attritional warfare that Germany had no realistic hope of winning. The mechanical catastrophe. Let's talk specifically about what happened to German armored vehicles during that winter, because this is where the title of this video really hits home. More German Panzers were rendered inoperable by frost than had been destroyed by Allied tanks in all previous engagements up to that point. That's not hyperbole. That's historical fact. The Panzer divisions were the tip of the German spear. These weren't just tanks, they were the core of the Blitzkrieg doctrine. Fast-moving, heavily armored, supported by mechanized infantry and air power, the Panzers had torn through Poland, France, the Low Countries, Yugoslavia, and Greece. They seemed unstoppable, but they had a fatal flaw. They were designed for European warfare, not Arctic conditions. German tanks used standard petroleum-based lubricants. In moderate climates, these worked perfectly. But when the temperature dropped below -20°C, these lubricants began to solidify. The engine oil turned into sludge. The transmission fluid stopped flowing. The hydraulic systems for the turret traverse and gun elevation froze. Even the grease in the tracks congealed. Starting a tank in these conditions required extraordinary measures. Crews would gather wood and build fires underneath the engine compartment, hoping to warm the oil enough to allow the engine to turn over. This process could take several hours, and it had to be done every single morning because if you let the tank sit overnight, it would freeze solid again. Some crews tried keeping the engines running constantly, but that burned through fuel at an unsustainable rate. A Panzer III or IV could go through an entire day's worth of fuel just idling to stay warm. And fuel was already in short supply because the supply lines were breaking down. When tanks did manage to start, they faced another problem: frozen ammunition. Armor-piercing rounds stored in sub-zero temperatures could crack or become brittle. The propellant charges could fail to ignite properly, leading to misfires or reduced muzzle velocity. High explosive shells sometimes failed to detonate. The main gun's recoil mechanism, which relied on hydraulic fluid, would freeze and fail to absorb the recoil properly. This could damage the gun mount or even injure the crew. Tank crews reported that their machine guns would fire a few rounds and then jam as the metal contracted in the cold. Trying to clear a jam with bare hands in -40° weather was a recipe for instant frostbite. Crews had to wear gloves, but gloves thick enough to prevent frostbite were too bulky to operate the delicate mechanisms of the weapons. It was a no-win situation. The tracks themselves became a problem. German tanks used relatively narrow tracks that provided good speed on roads but poor weight distribution in soft terrain. In deep snow, these tanks would sink and become immobilized. Crews would spend hours trying to dig out a bogged tank, only to have it get stuck again 100 yards later. The Soviets, by contrast, had learned from their own winter war with Finland in 1939 to 1940. Soviet tank design emphasized simplicity, reliability, and cold weather operation. The T-34, which was appearing in greater numbers by late 1941, was specifically designed for Russian conditions. It had wide tracks that distributed weight better in snow. Its diesel engine was more reliable in cold weather than gasoline engines. And critically, it had sloped armor that was more effective at deflecting German anti-tank rounds. When a German Panzer encountered a T-34 in winter conditions, the German crew was at a severe disadvantage. Their tank might not start. Their gun might be frozen. Their vision was limited by frost on the optics. Meanwhile, the T-34 could move, shoot, and maneuver effectively. It's not that the T-34 was invulnerable. German tank crews still scored kills, but the playing field had been leveled in a way that shocked the Wehrmacht. The Panzer IV, Germany's most capable medium tank at the time, was supposed to have superior optics, better crew ergonomics, and a more accurate gun. None of that mattered if the tank wouldn't start. By January 1942, entire panzer divisions were reporting that less than half their tanks were operational. And of those that were operational, many were immobilized by mechanical issues related to the cold. The maintenance crews were working around the clock trying to keep vehicles running, but they were fighting a losing battle. They didn't have the right tools for winter maintenance. They didn't have heated workshops. They were performing complex mechanical repairs with frostbitten fingers in open-air field positions while under occasional artillery fire. Here's a staggering statistic. By the end of the winter, the Germans had lost more tanks to mechanical failure and abandonment than to enemy action. Tanks that broke down and couldn't be repaired were destroyed by their own crews to prevent capture. Tanks that got stuck in snow drifts and couldn't be recovered were blown up. Tanks that suffered relatively minor damage but couldn't be evacuated due to the breakdown of logistics were left behind. The cumulative effect was catastrophic. Germany started Barbarossa with about 3,000 tanks. By spring 1942, they'd lost well over half of them, and a significant percentage of those losses were directly attributable to the winter weather. The aftermath and the lesson ignored. You'd think that after the winter of 1941 to 42, the German High Command would have learned their lesson. You'd think they would have prioritized winter equipment, cold weather training, and vehicles designed for Russian conditions. You'd be wrong. As 1942 rolled around and planning began for the summer offensive, the focus was on regaining momentum. Hitler redirected his strategic focus southward, toward Stalingrad and the Caucasus oil fields. The goal was to capture Soviet oil resources and strangle the Red Army's fuel supply. It was bold, ambitious, and ultimately led to an even greater disaster at Stalingrad. But the winter preparedness problems weren't fixed. The German army went into the winter of 1942 to 43 marginally better equipped than the previous year, but still nowhere near adequate for the conditions they'd face. When the Soviets encircled the 6th Army at Stalingrad in November 1942, the trapped German forces faced the same horrific winter conditions, but now they were cut off from supply. Frostbite, starvation, and disease killed tens of thousands of German soldiers inside the Stalingrad pocket. Of the 90,000 Germans who eventually surrendered, only about 5,000 ever made it home from Soviet captivity. The winter of 1941 to 42 was a turning point not because it ended the war, it didn't, but because it shattered the illusion of German invincibility. Proved that the Wehrmacht could be stopped. It showed that Hitler's strategic planning was fundamentally flawed. And it demonstrated that technology and training mean nothing if you're fighting an enemy on their home turf in conditions you're completely unprepared for. The Soviet counteroffensive in December 1941 was the first time the German army had been forced into a large-scale retreat since World War I. It was Hitler's first major defeat. And psychologically, it changed everything. German soldiers who'd believed they were fighting a short, victorious war suddenly realized they were in for a long, brutal slog. The myth of the invincible Panzer had been replaced by the reality of frozen tanks and dead crews. Back in Germany, Propaganda Minister Joseph Goebbels launched a massive campaign to collect winter clothing for the troops. On December 20, 1941, he delivered a radio address calling on German citizens to donate coats, gloves, scarves, anything warm. The appeal mixed patriotism with shame, contrasting the heroic sacrifices of frontline troops with the comfortable lives of civilians at home. The campaign collected millions of items, but much of it arrived too late or was inadequate for the extreme conditions. Donated civilian coats weren't designed for military use. They lacked proper insulation, they tore easily, and they didn't fit well over military gear. But it was something, and it helped boost morale at home by making civilians feel like they were contributing to the war effort. The Eastern Front would continue to grind on for another 3.5 years. The battles would grow larger, the casualties more horrific, the destruction more complete. Stalingrad, Kursk, Operation Bagration, each would dwarf the Battle of Moscow in scale. But the winter of 1941–42 was where Germany lost the war, even if it took years for that reality to fully manifest. The question historians still debate is whether Germany ever had a realistic chance of defeating the Soviet Union. Some argue that if Hitler hadn't diverted forces away from Moscow in August, if the Wehrmacht had captured the Soviet capital before winter, the war might have ended differently. Others point out that even if Moscow had fallen, the Soviet government could have relocated, the factories were already evacuated to the Urals, and Stalin showed no signs of surrendering. The Soviet Union had strategic depth Germany simply couldn't match. Russia's greatest advantage wasn't just its vast territory or its population. It was that the Russians knew how to fight on their own land. They understood the weather. They understood the terrain. They understood the distances involved. The Germans were fighting a foreign war in conditions they'd never trained for, using equipment that wasn't designed for it, with supply lines that couldn't sustain the effort. And winter, brutal, merciless, indiscriminate winter, became the great equalizer. The frost destroyed more German Panzers than all the Allied tanks combined up to that point because it didn't need to fight. It just needed to exist. So what's the lesson here? It's not just about weather or equipment or planning, though all of those matter. It's about hubris. Hitler was so convinced of German superiority, so certain that the Soviet Union would collapse like France, that he ignored basic realities. He gambled everything on a quick victory and refused to plan for anything else. When that gamble failed, the consequences were catastrophic. The German army in Russia was fighting not just the Red Army but geography, climate, logistics, and time itself. And it lost to all of them. The winter of 1941–42 didn't just freeze tanks and kill soldiers. It froze Hitler's entire strategic vision and killed the myth of German invincibility. By the time the spring thaw came in 1942, the war was already lost. Germany just didn't know it yet,